It is my great pleasure to introduce my colleague, Dr. Yuly Fuentes Medel, who is the program manager for fiber textiles at MIT and is also an advisor for closed loop partners in New York City. Yuly and I have had the pleasure to work together for many years, and one of the highlights of our collaboration is the FIT MIT workshop. This workshop really speaks to skill building and prototyping within the design and engineering sector, where we bring the engineers from MIT and the designers from FIT together. And they work together with industry so that they are solving real world problems in the design and textile industry. It's my pleasure again to turn this over to my colleague, Yuly.
Thank you, Joanne. For all these years, it's been my honor to work with you. I think we share this passion to build the workforce of the future. And I met you when I was doing the science, putting together fashion designers with scientists from the lab, a project that really flipped my career. But it opened up a window of opportunity in this intersection of what people can do when they get to work in a hybrid environment and they need to translate their ideas into, now, in the case of the MIT and FIT project, prototypes for a real product in the world with a company. Mm-hmm. So I think that's can take many forms, and the way we've been doing MIT and FIT really, I hope, gets replicated all over the world in the engineer schools, which is my role in MIT, really understanding how research in the technology space for fiber technologies, understanding textile as an entire supply chain, and bringing a new opportunity for the younger engineers in thinking how they are going to operate in their future jobs in this industry that, I don't know if the trend is going to go, we go naked, it's not going to stop.
Well, Yuly, I'm glad you raised that, because what you are describing for the engineers, we know is exactly what has to happen in the creative sector. And I think what the beauty of what we do together is we allow it to happen together, right? That's the only way we are going to change the textile industry and the supply chain, quite frankly. And so I think what is the magic, quite frankly, is that the designer and the engineer get to work together, where the designer says, I now know how to think engineering, and the engineering student says, and I now think like a designer.
Yeah, and I think the back in the day when I did this science, I called them the scientists of the future, when science and design gets merged. What we did here with the engineers and the designer is really, in the beginning, you're transforming their mindset. Because through education, they've been trained that they're either the analytical or the creatives, but they're both. And being able to trust a partner and work in collaboration, I think is really the core of this project that we're doing, allowing them to have a safe space to find a unique partner and then understand their own value in the education they have received from their own school.
As well as to really have them have the confidence. I think our students have shared this with us, that by creating this space, they gain the confidence in working in areas that they never dreamed they had the ability or the expertise to work within.
Yeah, and to me, it's special to do it in an industry that has history and centuries of production of things and goods for humans. And I think it happens that we forgot that textiles are important for our everyday life. So I think engineers now are in an environment where they're thinking about AI, cybersecurity, computational and digitization of the industry. But making them think back and how all that knowledge can contribute to an industry that needs to keep evolving, it's part of the process.
Exactly. I think that's definitely part of the process. And it's a really exciting part of the process, to be honest with you. That intersectional point. We've been talking a lot in the last few weeks, especially here at FIT, about how we use these intersectional points to look at our biggest global challenges, relating to all facets of environmental impact and the impact that we have at all points within a product's life cycle. So that's from, literally the farming and the capture of the fiber to its spinning process and all the way through the supply chain where it touches so many pieces. And in many cases, we have fibers that have a huge passport before we actually even make them into a garment. Exactly. So I think this conversation of how we think differently in the supply chain is really interesting, and how we think about reinventing it through partnerships and collaborations. So I'm really excited to hear a little bit more about your work in this space and how you're working to start to address and to think about some of these problems in different ways using different perspectives. So
what I have to tell you about myself in how do I approach this, number one, I'm always the one who knows the less about the topic. And my drive goes from learning from the others and understanding this industry. My PhD is in neuroscience. So I did my background is in biochemistry, so I know the molecular aspects of any material and material science. But then I did my PhD in neuroscience in the biomedical space, where there you're really trying to understand a system, which is the brain. And while I was in MIT doing my postdoctoral fellowship in economics of innovation, I identify the fashion industry as an industry that is been doing technologies, and the first step is to consider a textile as a piece of technology, but not really at the point where people think it's technology, because now the computer is in the cognition of everyone and the computer is technology, but the textile somehow stopped being technology. So that really was a pivoting point for me to really understand the process of the intersection between design, science, and now that we're doing the engineer intersection. And going back to the basic principle of economics of innovation, which is an economy of innovation happens not because of the institutions, not because FIT or MIT decided now they're going to teach a class in fashion. It happens because of the people. So the students are the key driver for this change, because they're the ones who can invent a new technology, create a new company, identify a flow in the supply chain of the textile industry and fix it and create a new way, create a new dyeing system, build it circular. They're going to be the ones who do it. So that economy won't happen if you don't have that entrepreneurial mind building the new thing. But if you don't make them aware of it and you don't make excitement about the topic, of course it's not going to happen. So that's been mostly my work and why I do this.
I think that's excellent. And in that bit, can you talk a little bit about some of the inspirations of your work and some of your partners? So things like maybe biomimicry, your partners who really stem no pun intended in this conversation, but STEM disciplines that are across all of the sciences and the engineering, but also in very different fields within the design industries as well.
Yeah, so when I invented the science, we were agnostic of what type of science will interact with a fashion designer. We think design is broad, right? You get graphic design, interior design, everything gets designed at some point. Every single thing that you have around you was designed by somebody, right? So we chose fashion at the time because we felt it was a human innate necessity that could live to develop behaviors that we haven't seen. And if that gets pollinated by science, new things could evolve from that. So we had people working in cancer science, had people working in marine science. It was really a testing bed on what could be the future. And it was 2013, and people like an expert in microbiology working in bacteria, sensing cancer in bacteria, was able to work with a fashion designer and invent a first ever bacteria pigment that will change color in a textile. That was 2013. We're in 2020, and now we have color fix, pili, mother meadow, fermenting leather and collagen. So that the fact that biology could play a role back in the day when we were just thinking this idea and really pollinating and seeding ideas wasn't a fact. So it was a crazy, really artistic. That project, for example, got nominated and featured in the MFA, Museum of Fine Arts here in Boston. Everyone saw it. And it was a provocative idea, but those are the conversations that have to happen for those companies to exist and for those textiles to exist. So that's just one example. We worked with people in the electronic engineer space, and it was addressed in that collection that it was sensing the noise around the room and changing color. What you needed to have there is a knowledge of electronic engineering for a textile to respond and being able to do something aesthetically pleasant in a piece of clothing. That was in the time when the circuit made was just being launched. People were thinking that how social media could interact with your clothing. So you need to sit and intercept those conversations to create that type of new innovations and new innovation economies to exist. And I don't know if I answered your question, but those are examples of things that inspirations. I don't really, for my job, I'm more the architect of innovation. I'm not the one who is designing a thing myself. If you watch the movie Matrix, I'm more of the architect of the Matrix than the guy who's choosing the blue or the red pill. And understanding the system, the inputs and the outputs of what's going to happen in a new economy where engineer, fashion, design, graphics interact and create new companies. It's part of my career, and understanding how you're going to measure that, what is the success of that, is also part of my training. So that's what I do for a living.
So I really think you did answer my question. And I actually think you touched at the very end on something wasn't my plan to follow up on it this way, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about the role that you can play and that people in the space who come maybe from backgrounds more similar to yours can play as the architect in designing or developing solutions that move our needle forward, to think about what our solutions are that can really change. I'm going to use the word impact. I know I used it previously, but I think we start to talk about, when we have micro impacts that in the end become macro impacts because they've been scaled. And I think that's something that I'd love to hear a little bit more from you about. I also think that our students are really interested in this spot where the roles are not always as defined as maybe they have been historically, and how there's space for that.
Yeah, so I think the best way to answer that is in the role of architect of innovation, you have essential components. One of them is the people who is going to create the innovations and how that builds a portfolio of research, of activities or ideas that could have a potential to be an economical value. That's one part. The second part is how do you enable those to activate more conversations and terminate into creating a something, right? Let's call the something that is going to be useful. But people who manage portfolios of technologies, the true secret for any good portfolio of technology is that they have to be in context of human behavior. Let me give you an example. The iPhone was invented for us to communicate as a phone, but it has so many other aspects of our everyday life of a human that now is something we can imagine not living without. And I'm not making the iPhone a thing. It's just the idea that you combine new behaviors in one thing, changing the way that we think about a phone completely, right? The simplest one is that the clock. Men used to have the clock in their pocket, and the movement of this was watching for time. Now we just get to do that in a phone. So when you're thinking what is going to happen to human behavior in the future, and you invent technologies that enable that positive behavior, you are managing and architecting a good economy of innovation. As an architect of innovation, you also have the responsibility to understand what is going to be also good for humans and the planet. And that's the role I play in my advisory role, for example, for the firm Closed Loop Partners. They are the ones who are investing heavily in assets on circular economy and how that could be an important play on how are we going to be living our next 100 years in planet Earth, right? So when you bet technologies to be part of innovation, you're thinking, what is going to be the impact of human behavior, how society is going to benefit out of that, and what are the type of products that need to be designed in order to accomplish that futuristic role, right? And back into the people who design those, which is closing the loop of the conversation of mixing engineer design, the biggest role here is to make these young minds to understand that what they can create can change the world. And they are creating the future in the moment that they are putting together their ideas. And we are living a world in 2020 that was invented 30 years ago by people who was just imagining the future. So we are consequence of that, and we are building consequence too.
I think that's a really interesting point to think about circular economy, planetary boundaries, how we address planetary boundaries in connection with true kind of economic and impacts that truly impact our whole society, not just here in the US, but internationally and globally in that space. But I love this conversation and thought regarding how students who are working today and collaborating are really putting ideas and concepts and blocks into motion that will shape our future. I think, your point is incredibly valid. I worked early in my career on things that related to flexible displays. And the reality is that work in flexible displays is what sits in your iPhone and on many of our touch screens today. But at the time I did it, it was, can we understand how we're passing energy, what color, what happens if we make a connection? Can we build a lattice that supports any of this? The goal wasn't necessarily to think about it in terms of what its real end product would be, and also to think about what that end product's impact might have on our society and on our environment. So I think when we think about this conversation now today and how the work that we're seeing great things come out of in collaborative natures, the FIT-MIT partnership is just one of I mean, you and I could go around and find a number of other partnerships that are interdisciplinary collaborations that are working on this. But how do we work to the point where even scientists, when they think about creating something that might be a flexible display, they're actually thinking in the end about what the true environmental impact or impact on our society could be?
So there is a paper about sustainability that is a historical record on for how long we've been talking about the environmental impact. United States has EPA. Europe has all these regulatory units that I think today the world has put environment regulation as the punishment incentive, not as the incentive of why to do it. And missing out the huge economical opportunity in building in synchrony with the environment. And one of the key points there is the end of use of products and thinking, how are we preparing our students in thinking in the whole life cycle of a product? I mean, that's a basic 101 class that I always think that every single person in any career should have. Just the fact that you get to understand how your clothing was made. It's a surprise to people. It's something we don't reveal. It's kind of, if you go to the opera and you reveal the curtain, and then behind the scene, the opera player has many people working around to make that magical moment of singing a unique experience, right? So the other one, I have had the pleasure to support some schools around the country and review some curriculums. And it's interesting because they call it the Master of Science and Merchandising. And I have to question, okay, what is your science in your curriculum? I mean, are you teaching Physics 101 and understanding color as a wavelength, right? So we assume things as a fact, and that's also the structure that education was built in. If you go back into the history of innovation, the departments of universities were invented to silo ideas. And now we are forced to think, no, this is a system, it's way more complex, it's not one silver bullet solution, and we need to all to talk again together. So literally, we're building again a new language of collaboration and co-creation that need to exist because we live in a complex world. I mean, what happened in the middle of Brazil or Colombia will impact what's happening in the middle of Texas, no matter what. We are a system, and if we don't think in system thinking, it's really hard to build a future.
I think you touch on some really interesting points. I'm going to change our view here so that we can have a little bit more dialogue about this one here. So I think thinking about curriculum and programmatic structures to me becomes a really interesting conversation in how we're changing the whole system.
Right.
You know, if I thought today, if I gave you no boundaries as to what it was or silos you had to break to get there, what would be the ideal basic freshman level curriculum program that you would develop that would help students be prepared to start thinking about solutions, addressing the circular economy, addressing our environmental challenges, addressing both social and economic? What would that look like?
I think what students are experiencing now in what I used to experience when I was a young college student is completely different. I like to think in curriculums that you can choose, but at the same time, you don't know what you don't know. So there are certain responsibilities that they are shared in that education. The responsibility of the school who is setting values to students. I think we're no longer giving content. content is in YouTube, internet, online education. We're truly building values to younger people. And one of the values you're mentioning here is how do we cultivate a value for impact. I'm an alumni of MIT, and the reason also to work here is that in MIT, we have that saying called minds and hands. So we don't just learn the thing, we do it and we execute it. So it has to be hands-on things. And that sets a difference between engineers from MIT and other schools, because they get to prototype, they get to do the things and work with the companies and do activities in the real world. But they are the ones who are asking the impact question because it's in them. They believe that because they're here, they're going to change the world. And that sets life, because if you are trained to do that, you believe you can do it, and then the environment and the people around you allow you to do it, well, you probably will do it. And I think MIT has the records of showing alumni doing incredible things in all the aspects, from social innovation, from technological innovation, from health science, from architecture, from how we think about the cities, and changing behavior, and not just thinking about the technology as an isolated component of their piece. So that curriculum to me has to look in a way that everyone shares a responsibility. And when you're choosing a school, you're choosing a way of thinking. And how that will interact with the values, with the society that you want to live on.
That's kind of an interesting way to consider it, which is that the mindset of innovation and the need to solve problems is something that we kind of cultivate in the ability to design what is often really referred to as problem-based curriculum. And in many cases, just by its inherent nature, problem-based curriculum is very interdisciplinary in its nature. It's not focused on only electrical engineering principles or background, but it requires that if you don't know it, you study it and you learn it. The same is true from environmental engineering. The list could go on and on.
I think so before we were really focusing who is the expert and who is the generalist, the one who can manage and know everything, and the one who can go really deep in a topic. We need both. We need but I think now the generalist also is playing a really incredible, important role in being the integrator. Because, and I'm just going to give you an example. When I'm playing a role, for example, in investment, right? There's a person there who really knows the finance, and that is so important for making the right economical decision. But in that economical decision, there is the person who is thinking about the technology, the person who is thinking about the impact of the technology for environmental reasons, the person who is thinking about the market space that is going to get correct, or the user impacts. So there are many decisions, and somebody has to integrate that into a good decision for making an investment. That happened across the industries, right? In food, you get to make decisions about human health when you are making a product that is going to impact human intake, right? So all the products have now that complex aspect. Now you get the manifestation in companies, for example, they have sustainability departments. That wasn't the case a couple of years ago, right? But that's including a new voice in the conversation of what type of products, for example, a brand, in the case of fashion, is going to decide to make, right? A couple of years ago, fashion companies weren't selling online. E-commerce wasn't a technology. So now they need to integrate people that is kind of having that conversation on how I'm going to be measuring my channels of e-commerce, right? So as we accelerate in new technologies, we accelerate how we interact. We're seeing it, right? We're seeing it now in the biggest social experiment in a pandemic year. And And you are going to impact literally the well-being of us humans in the planet.
I think that's really an interesting way to talk about the fact that we've long, in many of our interdisciplinary partnerships, seen the value of putting different voices and people with different backgrounds in the same room, and, for lack of a better word, letting them have a single problem to do it. I think we have to think about now creating that as the norm. So not discouraging focused study in specific areas, but also providing opportunities to study in many of the arts of collaborations and partnerships to do that as well.
Yeah, and I think the other point I will touch there is industries that are learning how to collaborate. It's not only the CEO who is making that decision. It's their legal department that is learning how to do the contract to share value on the end game for that collaboration to happen. Is their financial department making a decision of budget, in what budget line that collaboration is going to be integrated, and who is going to manage it, who is going to be in the conversation for that collaboration to happen. And if you just think about the economy of innovation on diversity, because this is literally diversity of the voices, it's harder to manage a diverse group of voices. So it gets more complex, but it enhances your ability to innovate.
Right. I think that's true. It becomes more complex, but it gives a lot of space towards the space of innovation. Now, when we think of innovation, a lot of times we think of smaller prototype ideas and concepts. They're not yet to the further ends of the product development phase. So how do we help bridge some of the really exciting innovations we see here that are really utilizing new materials? They're using materials that are more they're more biologically active, that maybe they're made from algae. How do we help those make their way through the supply chain so they become real options at the end? Because I often see a big gap between what we can do here and we talk about in small collaborations, small think tanks, but it seems like it's almost a hurdle that's impossible to make the leap to get to the point where, it's just normal for me to choose to buy a garment that is, based in a biomaterial that I can, in fact, literally could compost itself at the end of its, useful life. At the point it's no longer, fit to wear in general, it could literally reinvent itself or do that without such impact.
Yeah, I get to see that quite often in my roles, in both in the MIT role and in the investor role. I think we are now in a stage when we know that it's important to happen, right? Because if you really want to evolve the industry, particularly the textile industry and the supply chain of the fashion industry, I think today the industry understands that that's a must do. The question is how you do it, and what are the mechanisms that you create in order for everyone to play in the party. I think the industry is learning how to do it. There's not set rules yet. We're in that space where we're still learning how to do it. There are some economical models like consortiums that, one example is out there, for example, the Milo leather, which is a bio-made from mycelium leather now that is going to be used in different market sectors, in luxury, in sports. And then companies have to agree into everyone get their piece, but then the economical incentives are there for everyone to enjoy this new vegan leather that they're calling, right? So that you need to create that economical model and economical incentives for a startup to be playing with a big corporation. The barrier today, and consortium is one example, but it could be many others, right? What you're speaking up here is more about the scale up process, right? And other industries have accomplished a scale up. Think about the electric companies, right? Today you have solar panels across the United States. That at some point was a small, tiny bits, a material of silica capturing solar. I was a prototype in the lab of a professor or a student in their dorm. How that got now to be broadly adopted by everyone in their houses takes time. It takes economical investment, take management of risk of that economical investment, and it takes champions. It takes people to keep dreaming about that and really navigating the scale-up process from going from 1 centimeter to 1 kilometer to wherever you need to build and prototype in order to be a sustainable business that at the same time is providing an impactful new technology for people, right? The other way around this is to invent the whole industry from zero, right? When we are thinking in the behavior of transportation and we went from the boat to the plane, nobody was putting wings to big ships and cargos in the ocean. They went for inventing the cargo and now the plane. And the plane is a completely different new technology that now can fly, and today we see it as an everyday adventure, right? But it's a piece of technology that every time I see as a plane on the sky, it's a surprise of technology, right? The fact that
It was a massive
taking a
accomplishment
risk,
in physics and engineering.
Is going into a vacuum tube, and that's going to take you a few hours to a new destination. It's just a miracle of prototyping in scale technology for transportation. So the fashion industry and the textile industry and the supply chain need to learn what is going to be adoptable, what is going to be feasible, and the meals and the segmentation and the fragmentation of the supply chain also needs to find coordination. So technologies for transparency and targeting each space of the supply chain will be tremendously important. Technologies for sorting materials and identifying materials that will be disposable, or understanding where to find a landfill and this not have really the thinking of a landfill are going to be instrumental to really grow this. And the demand that is changing, right? Now the younger people is asking for a different type of product. So it's not only one thing that is going to change the whole system. Again, it's a several changes that has to happen in synchrony for that technology to be adopted and make it into massive markets.
And it's that level of adoption system-wide that takes something that, if you look at it by itself, is very small, but has a really big impact in the end.
Yeah, and I think if you look back in who has been able to do it, the storytelling, the dream of what is going to happen to you if this happens. You're not going to depend on the electricity of the city. You could have your house receiving solar energy and storage in your house. You can charge your car in your backyard.
Yeah,
that was a dream.
That was a dream.
Reality.
I mean, I think, it's in many cases, I think the rate and pace to which the automotive industry is now starting to change will really be an interesting one in that space, because for a long time we had electric cars, but they weren't accessible to a mass market, and they weren't being produced to serve that.
But I think you got to think about Mr. Ford, and his vision was that every single American should have a car, set up the way he scaled up the manufacturing of a car.
Exactly. And now you're seeing these big companies with that vision, that idea that everybody should have a car and have access to a car, making the commitment by 2030, I believe, in many cases, that they're no longer going to produce any gasoline or fossil fuel based cars, which.
And that was started by Tesla thinking, how do we change the transportation system to a fully renewable system, right?
Well, and I think Tesla's different than, say, Toyota, because Toyota made the Prius and they did so early on with good success, but they didn't stop making the gas equivalent to it. They continued to make that, and Tesla only makes alternative.
And
that
that's
to me is
in
a fundamentally different model.
Absolutely. So how you approach the same human behavioral change also can happen. And that's what you train students to think and learn how to do, right? And those kind of cases kind of teach them what does fit them, right? Do they want to invent the next Ford that is electric, or do they want to disrupt the capture of energy model, and by the way, build a car, build a spaceship, build something else, right? So that's what really we're in creating inception in our younger generation in how they want to think about how they build the future, because not everyone has to do it in the same way.
Right. It's this idea of using disruptive design principles, but not just using them in the design of a physical object, but using them in disruptive design in big systems and big picture problems in that space. You know, and I want to think back to we were previously talking about how and what we might think about were important curricular components and mindsets for students to have. And to me, I almost come back and think, if I had the opportunity to really reinvent what I took when I was in school, there are courses that I didn't take that existed then. And then now there are courses, you know, life cycle assessment was certainly something that was not really offered when I was in school.
Yeah.
But, you know, it would be so valid. And, you know, as a scientist, they offered statistics, you know, for mathematicians and computer science, but it was like there was a special track for statistics, you know, chemistry, biology. Everybody seemed to have their own variation on statistics. And I almost think there's two models. One is you teach everybody these fundamental principles and what looking at a life cycle really is, or you start to actually embed it, like statistics is, in all of the disciplines without really talking about it. It's something that you're going to do in all phases, which is to study and understand life cycle, but do it from different perspectives with different foci.
Yeah, and I think, so I come from Latin America background. So my background was more, at 18-year-old, you need to know what you're gonna do when you grow up. And you decide about it. Mine was biochemistry, for example. So I needed to be an expert in molecules, and I needed to be an expert working in a hospital, understanding human physiology, right? But then it turns out that I could do so many other things. And then every class I took at school wasn't really what I used it to do then, neuroscience or now economics. So I believe in learning by doing. And I think we are in a time where we can really do it. Because the content and information is out there. And the idea of constantly prototyping what you're building allows you to kind of, and that's why I say before is that I like to be the one who knows less in the room, because I learn from the rest and I can add value there to kind of integrate where are we really going, right?
And maybe ask some really tough questions while you get your head around what they're thinking about in terms of the economics, which often provides a lot of insight into problem solving.
But at this point in my career, I have learned to speak many languages: government language, academic language, corporate language, economic language, science language. So I feel blessed that I can do it. Not everyone can do it, but it's also basics human empathy, right? You want to speak from the shoes from the other and build trust and create new projects, products, relationships. It's just, I think when we are training younger people, we're really training them to be humans.
I think, yeah, training them and providing them opportunities to feel empowered to try things and to feel empowered that sometimes they try things and they don't work.
Managing failure.
Managing failure and having failure be something that you learn from.
Absolutely.
I mean, there's so many things that I've tried and I'm like, ooh, I didn't do that right the first time, but let me try it again. I'm going to get it right. Pretty sure I learned how to fix a plumbing problem in our house the other day using exactly that principle.
Yeah.
Which is, I'm going to take it apart and I'm going to then figure out how to fix the problem and reassemble it. And okay, that might take 2 or 3 passes to get it just right, but that's okay.
Yeah. And the science background teaches the science method, right? So in the science method, you have to formulate an hypothesis about something is going to work or not. It's a yes-no hypothesis. And then you keep trying, right? So if the hypothesis gives you to no, you keep trying again and formulate the hypothesis again. So I'm used to that. And I think that's also kind of a fundamental difference from other training that they're more about learning how to do it, but the science training allows you to have tools to formulate the yes and no hypothesis. And I think by mental deformation, I operate that way constantly.
I think I operate much the same way where you're doing that all the time and using those methods that are taught in our training, but applying them in different scenarios. If you were to offer our students who are now, in our case at FIT, primarily either in the business side of the house or in the design side of the house, one piece of advice that you think would help them work towards pushing the needle to solutions here, what would it be?
Don't stop being curious. And don't be afraid to ask the dumb questions.
I would tell you that there are no dumb questions and not to be afraid to ask all the questions.
They're not dumb questions, but the belief is that they are. So
I think that I would encourage, I love that. I think the curiosity is key. I think being willing to try is key. And being willing to ask questions and not worry that your question won't be either understood or is too basic.
Yeah, and I mean, a 20-year-old today, or at that stage, we are bombarded for a lot of information. So filtering information, what is right, what is wrong, it's part now of our everyday life, right?
Right.
Understanding and choosing what to follow, what to see, what to understand is really hard because now you need to pick in among of hundreds. In our time, it was among 20, right? So check their facts, understand, read the New York Times, understand where the world is going, build and learn in context. That's part of being young and learn from mistake.
Excellent. I think that's really great advice for our students. Are there any other kind of parting words you want to share with us? I feel like we've covered a lot of topics today.
Yeah. I mean, I think this panel is in context of enhancing and empowering the change makers, right?
Yes.
So a change maker comes from inside out. It's every single person has the potential to be a change maker. You don't have to be in a special place or in a special school to be a change maker. If you happen to be in a special place, identify that you are there and take the opportunity. But a change maker can be in any given place, in any given society, space, and do a small or a big change. So our students are in this privileged position that they're really in an environment where they can make that change. So don't lose that opportunity.
Excellent. Thank you. This was such a great conversation to have as part of our Changemakers series in our annual Sustainable Business and Design Conference. And Joanne and I both want to thank you on behalf of FIT, but also on behalf of the National Endowment of the Arts, which helped support this session and has been a longtime supporter of work that's really looking at the intersection of science and design and how we can utilize that to push the needle forward and provide us new visual options that give us curiosity, but also possibly new scientific pathways. So again, on behalf of myself, I thank you. For those of you who missed my introduction early on, I'm Karen Pearson. I chair the Department of Science and Math and the Sustainability Council here at FIT. And as I said, it was my great pleasure to have the opportunity to chat with Yuly today and to look at this intersectional point and to put that in context with the other programs that we've had in this series. So thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.